Welcome back. I was going through the stack of scripts this week, and this one made me stop before I'd even reached the middle. The title tells you the outcome. What it doesn't prepare you for is the moment, quiet, almost administrative, where she makes the decision that guarantees his. A form, a date, a phone call from a parking lot.
The courtroom smelled like old carpet, and central heating turned up past the point of comfort. That specific institutional warmth that has nowhere to go, that just accumulates in a room until everyone sitting in it feels slightly wrong. I was in the third row, not the first. The first row is for people who want to be seen responding. I was there to watch and to remember and to feel the chair pressing against the back of my legs while the judge said the words that ended 19 months of very careful, very quiet work. 3 years. I didn't cry. I wasn't waiting to cry. The woman to my left was wearing a perfume I almost recognized, something floral and faintly industrial, the kind you find in hotel lobbies, and I focused on it for a moment, while the words settled into the air of the room and became real. 3 years. Was the projected release date, calculated automatically, the better part of my early 30s. And then his name, spoken by a court officer in a tone that made it sound like any other name, which I suppose by then it was. Elena was sitting beside me. She had driven 3 hours that morning, because that is the kind of person she is, and she touched my hand once, briefly, without squeezing, the way she does when she doesn't want to make something bigger than it is. "That's it," she said quietly. "Yes," I said. "It was. I want to tell you how we got there, because when people hear the title of this story, he forced her to drop the restraining order. He violated it immediately. He got 3 years. They fill in a narrative that is mostly correct in its facts and completely wrong in its structure. And they imagine a trap laid in a single decisive moment, a confrontation, a dramatic reversal. What actually happened was 19 months of documentation, 19 months of time-stamped notes and backed-up photographs and cloud-stored audio files and a very organized attorney who charged reasonable fees and kept extraordinarily careful records. 19 months of being, as Gideon later told the court, the most prepared petitioner he had encountered in 31 years of domestic litigation. This is a story about preparation. About what it looks like when a woman decides that her experience of her own life is worth recording in detail from the beginning, before she knows exactly why she'll need it. It starts earlier than Dorian. It starts with me. I met Dorian Crow at an industry conference in the autumn. I was 28. He was 34. And he worked in private equity, and he had a particular quality that I have since learned to name, but at the time only registered as a feeling. He looked at you like you were the most interesting problem in the room. Like the space between you and him was already a conversation he was having. We talked for 2 hours by the hotel bar. He ordered water. I noticed this. Men who order water at conference bars are either in recovery or deliberate. They are either keeping track of themselves or keeping track of you. And at 28, I told myself it was the first thing and let the second thought pass through me without landing. He called 3 days later. Not a text. A phone call, which in that particular year was already slightly unusual, and which I registered as attentiveness. And he said, "I've been thinking about what you said about the liability structures in your presentation. I think you were right, and I want to discuss it more, but I also want to take you to dinner." He had been in the audience for my presentation. He remembered a specific argument. He asked me to dinner in the same sentence, and the sequence, professional observation, then desire, felt like the right order of things. Like he had earned the second by genuinely attending to the first. I said yes. The first year was good. I am not revising this. I am not telling myself the retrospective story in which the warning signs were visible from the beginning, and I chose to ignore them, because that story isn't true, and I think it does a particular kind of damage. It turns surviving into a failure of observation. Yes, when what it actually requires is time and proximity, and the specific erosion that comes from living with someone who is very skilled at managing what you see. He was attentive in the way that, early on, registers as devotion. He remembered details. He asked follow-up questions about conversations we'd had weeks before, which felt like proof that he had been listening, which I now understand was proof that he had been filing. He met my friends, and he was warm with them, generous, interested. He met Elena, who does not like many people, and whose dislike is usually accurate, and she told me afterward that she thought he seemed genuine. She was wrong about him. She told me this later, in the specific flat way she delivers things she can't change. I was wrong, and I looked at him, and I was wrong. I told her that being wrong about someone who is very deliberately performing rightness is not a failure of judgment. She accepted this and did not bring it up again, which is also the kind of person she is. The early months with Dorian had the texture of something I hadn't known to want. He made space for my work in a way that men I'd dated before hadn't. He asked about projects by name, followed up, seemed genuinely interested in the mechanics of what I did. He made me feel, in the specific way that is hardest to describe and most important to name, seen. Later, I would understand that being seen is not the same as being known, that he had been cataloging, not witnessing, that every detail he stored was being filed not out of love, but out of something more strategic and more patient. But at that point, I did not know this. At that point, I was 30 years old and in love, and the particular quality of that love, the feeling of being the most interesting problem in the room, was something I mistook for reciprocity. The first thing I can point to now, with the benefit of distance and the particular clarity that comes from 19 months of documentation, happened 6 months in. We were at a dinner party in the Thornfield neighborhood, at the house of someone Dorian knew professionally, one of those houses that has bookshelves built into the walls and a fireplace that actually works, and a quality of abundance that isn't ostentatious but simply assumes itself. I was at ease in most rooms, but not quite at ease in that one, because belonging there required a performance I hadn't fully learned. And Dorian navigated it so naturally that I was conscious of my own navigation in a way I wasn't used to. I mentioned a colleague, a male colleague, someone I'd been working on a project with, a peer, someone I genuinely liked and respected, and whose name came up naturally in the context of work I was describing. I said something mildly complimentary, the kind of thing you say at dinner parties when you're explaining a professional success. Marcus really drove the methodology on this one. It wouldn't have landed without him. Dorian was warm for the rest of the evening. He refilled my wine glass. He laughed at the right moments. He said the right things to the right people. There was nothing to observe. In the car on the way home, he said, "You talk about Marcus quite a bit." I considered this. I don't think I do. You mentioned him 4 times tonight. I didn't know if he was right. I hadn't been counting. I was genuinely uncertain whether this was an accurate observation or a piece of theater. "He's my project lead," I said. "I'll mention him sometimes." "Of course," Dorian said. He looked at the road. The city passed through the windshield in long streaks of light. He didn't say anything else. By the time we arrived home, the subject was closed, and I had almost convinced myself it hadn't happened. But I thought about it in the days that followed, And what I noticed, in the way you notice something by feeling its absence, was that I stopped mentioning Marcus at home. Not because Dorian asked me to. He never asked me to. I simply recalibrated, the way you do when you've touched a surface and found it unexpectedly warm, and you don't touch it again without thinking first. This is the mechanism. Not a demand. An atmosphere. The specific gravity of someone else's displeasure, never named, never located, never available to be argued with. You can't fight a temperature. You can only acclimatize to it, and in acclimatizing, you reorganize yourself, slowly and without noticing, around its contours. I didn't name this for what it was for another 18 months. The reorganization was gradual enough that by the time I saw it clearly, it was already thorough. He had opinions about how I dressed that were framed as preferences, never demands, always observations, delivered lightly in a tone that said, "I notice this," not "you must change this." He had thoughts about my friendships, particularly the older ones that were framed as concern. "I just think she takes more from you than she gives. I worry about you after you spend time with her." When I worked late, he didn't argue. He was simply, quietly, visibly hurt. And explaining yourself for choices that are entirely ordinary is its own specific erosion. Not dramatic, not violent, just the slow wearing away of the sense that your ordinary choices belong to you. The distance from my friends grew over the second year. I told myself I was busy. I was genuinely busy. Work was demanding. The relationship required energy. Time was genuinely short. But Elena, who has the particular tenacity of a person who decides you're worth knowing and then continues deciding it indefinitely, must tracked me down for lunch on a Tuesday and sat across from me at a table by the window and said, with the specific manner of someone who has been preparing what they're going to say, "You checked your phone 4 times in the last 30 minutes. I'm expecting a work email. The second time you checked it, you relaxed. The third time you tensed up again before you checked." She paused. "You're monitoring whether he's called." I put the phone face down on the table. "He doesn't like it when I'm out without telling him where I am," I said. I said it as though it were a normal sentence, a statement of reasonable fact, like describing a colleague's dietary requirement or a scheduling preference. I heard myself say it, and I did not hear, in real time, the way it sounded. Elena looked at me for a long time. She is an accountant, and accountants have the specific patience of people who have learned that numbers don't lie, but do sometimes hide, and that if you look at them long enough from the right angle, they will eventually show you what they've been doing. "Mara," she said, "do you hear yourself?" I heard myself. That was the problem. And eventually, it became the solution. After that lunch, I started writing things down. Not a journal, nothing that lived in the apartment, nothing that could be found or read or that required an explanation if noticed. I made a folder in my phone's notes app called Grocery Lists, and inside it I kept a running document that looked, to anyone who glanced at it, like incomplete shopping notes. In practice, it was a time-stamped record of specific incidents. I used a consistent format. Date. Time. What was said or done. Or what preceded it. What followed. I started doing this because I needed to know whether I was catastrophizing. I have a precise mind, and I know its limits. I know that memory is reconstructive, that emotion colors recollection, that when you are unhappy in a relationship, it is possible to retroactively tint ordinary events with significance they didn't have. I wanted data. I wanted the unedited record of what was actually happening, preserved before my memory could adjust it. The data was not reassuring. What the notes revealed, over 6 weeks of consistent recording, was not chaos, Not rage, not violence, not obvious abuse. What they revealed was management, a sustained, consistent, evidently deliberate pattern of control that had the quality not of impulse, but of strategy. Every restriction had a pattern. What every isolation had a precedent. Every moment of quiet pressure could be traced to a prior moment of quiet establishment. I read back through the notes one evening while Dorian was at a work dinner. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water, and I read everything I had written, and I felt, very clearly and without drama, that I was looking at a document I would eventually need to show someone. I didn't know yet who, I didn't know yet what for, but I kept the notes. That was the single most important decision I made during the 2.5 years of that relationship. Not the leaving, not the legal action. The notes. The physical incident happened 2 years and 4 months in. We were in the kitchen. He was angry about something peripheral to both of us. A work frustration, a deal that had gone wrong, something that had nothing to do with me, and that I had the misfortune of being present for. I said something that he heard as dismissive. I was tired, and I had been, for several months, quietly pulling back on the constant labor of managing his emotional temperature, and in that tiredness I said something that landed the wrong way. He grabbed my wrist. Not a hit, not a shove. A grip. His hand around my wrist, fingers pressing inward, hard enough that I felt it in my bones and not just my skin. He let go immediately. He looked at his own hand with the expression of someone who has observed themselves do something they did not consciously instruct, and I found this, in the moment, more disturbing than rage would have been. Rage I could have located and responded to. This was something quieter, and therefore less contained. "I'm sorry," he said. He meant it, in the specific way of someone who is frightened by themselves and is hoping that the apology will close the incident before it has to be examined. I left the room. I went to the bathroom and locked the door, and sat on the cold tile floor and looked at my wrist. The skin was unmarked in the immediate aftermath. I knew from the depth of the pressure that it wouldn't stay unmarked. I sat on the floor for several minutes. Then I took out my phone and photographed my wrist under the bathroom light, the LED quality that is unflattering and precisely accurate, from 2 angles. The photograph was time-stamped 10:47 p.m. on a Thursday in October. I backed it up immediately to a cloud storage account I had created 2 months earlier on a library computer, was linked to an email address that existed only on that library's system and which I accessed only from public terminals. The account was in my name, but carried no trace of our shared life. No linked contacts, no connected services, nothing that shared infrastructure with any account Dorian knew about. That backup was the second most important decision I made in that relationship. The first was the notes. The second was this. Every piece of evidence I gathered from that moment forward went to cloud storage within minutes of capture, backed up in 3 locations, with timestamps that could not be altered after the fact. By the following morning, there was a bruise on my wrist in the precise shape of 4 fingers. I photographed it again in daylight. I added a note to the grocery lists document. I included the time, the context, the specific words that had been spoken, and a clinical description of the injury. I did not leave that night. I did not leave for another 3 months. I want to be honest about this because the alternative, pretending the decision to leave was instantaneous, or inevitable, or simple, flattens the reality of how these situations work. What I did in those 3 months was something different from staying. I was preparing. And preparation, when it is done correctly and invisibly, looks from the outside exactly like paralysis. Over the following 10 weeks, I moved money, Not all at once. Not in a single transfer that would appear on a statement and require explanation. I moved it slowly, in amounts below any threshold that might register. 100 here, 200 there. Was it the kind of movement that looks like ordinary spending in a life that involves ordinary spending? I transferred it to an account at a credit union 3 neighborhoods away from anywhere associated with our shared life, opened in my name only, with no joint access provision, using a mailing address I had created at a postal service center in a neighborhood I had no other reason to visit. I also began removing documents from the apartment. This took longer because the documents were in a shared filing drawer, and removing them all at once would have been noticed. I moved them in my work bag over the course of 6 weeks, a few at a time, slipping them into the front pocket beneath my laptop. Birth certificate, passport, social security card. The originals of my employment contracts, which contained provisions I might eventually need. My graduate transcripts, a copy of the lease, which was in both our names. I stored everything in the same lockbox at the postal center. I had chosen a postal center because postal service centers are not banks and do not share infrastructure with financial institutions, and because I paid for the box in cash at the initial setup so that there was no credit card trace linking me to it. I want to explain where this knowledge came from because it didn't come from instinct. 2 years earlier, working in risk assessment, I had read an article in a legal affairs journal about the financial and logistical architecture of leaving dangerous domestic situations. The article had been written by an attorney who specialized in these cases, and it described, in precise, practical terms, the steps that make departure survivable: pre-separation financial independence, document removal, evidence preservation, the establishment of a support infrastructure that exists entirely outside the shared life. I had filed the article away at the time, bookmarked it in a folder on my work computer labeled Reference, alongside articles on insurance liability and contract law, without a clear sense of why I was keeping it. Now, I understood why I had kept it. The most vulnerable moment in a domestic situation, the article had said, is the moment of departure. Not the months before, not the years after, the departure itself, and the immediate window following it. A person who leaves with nothing, no money, no documents, no established safe contacts, is at maximum risk, and a person who has been quietly building parallel infrastructure for months is at significantly reduced risk. I was building parallel infrastructure. I left on a Wednesday morning while Dorian was at work. His schedule that day was known to me because we maintained a shared digital calendar, which he had established early in the relationship as a coordination tool, and which I had, for the past 2 months, been using to track his movements as carefully as he had always used it to track mine. I had told the building management office, in writing 3 weeks earlier, that I intended to vacate and that I would need documentation of the move-out date for legal purposes. I phrased it exactly that way, legal purposes, and the woman at the management desk gave me a look of precise, professional recognition and handed me the documentation without asking any questions I didn't want to answer. The taxi came at 9:40 in the morning. I had, over the previous 6 weeks, reduced my presence in the apartment to what fit in 2 bags. Everything I actually needed had already been removed, piece by piece, over months, camouflaged as ordinary daily transit. What remained in the apartment was furniture, kitchen equipment, and the accumulated decorative life of 2 people who had been, for a time, building something together. I did not look back at the building as the taxi pulled away, not for the cinematic effect. I simply had no interest in that view. And I spent the first 3 weeks in a furnished studio I had found through a listing service that had no connection to any platform Dorian used or any neighborhood his network frequented. I paid the first month in cash from the savings I had moved. I kept my phone location services disabled, except when I was navigating somewhere I needed to be. During those 3 weeks, I did 3 things. I contacted Gideon. Elena had found him for me. She had done it the way she does everything, methodically, without fanfare, researching specifically for an attorney with a proven record in protective order cases who did not operate within the corporate orbit that Dorian's world inhabited. She had interviewed 2 others before presenting him to me with a 2-paragraph assessment. Good record, clean billing history, and not the kind of attorney who settles cases to protect his schedule. His office was above a dry cleaner in a part of the city that had no aesthetic or social overlap with anything I associated with Dorian. He was 61 years old. He had reading glasses he wore on the end of his nose, and a voice that moved the way slow water moves. Deliberate, without hurry, absolutely clear about where it was going. He sat across from me at his desk and read every document I'd brought him without interrupting once. The complete grocery lists file, printed, the photographs, the screenshotted text messages, organized chronologically with an index, the call logs, the audio recordings. I had been running a voice recorder app intermittently since the previous February, so capturing specific conversations in which the patterns of control were audible if you knew what you were listening for. When he finished, he looked up and said, "You've been doing this for a while. Keeping records? Preparing." He set the documents down precisely. Most people come in with a feeling and one photograph. You came in with a case. I didn't know that was what I was doing, I said. He looked at me over his glasses. I think some part of you did. He filed the petition on a Thursday. The temporary protective order was granted the following Monday. It required Dorian to maintain 300 feet of distance from me, my residence, and my workplace, and prohibited contact by any means, phone, text, email, or through third parties acting on his behalf. I had 4 laminated copies made, 1 in my bag, 1 in my desk at work, 1 with Gideon, 1 in the lockbox. The order held for 22 days. I will not describe those 22 days as peaceful, because that would be inaccurate. I had lived with someone for 2.5 years, whose emotional state I had learned to monitor with the hypervigilance of someone whose safety depended on the reading. That hypervigilance does not stop when the threat is legally required to stay 300 feet away. It simply redirects toward the possibility of violation, toward every phone buzz and unknown number and shadow in a peripheral sight line. But he complied, technically, for 22 days. And then his mother called. Arabella Crow was a tall, precise woman who had maintained throughout our relationship a tone of warm pleasantness toward me that I had always recognized, and in the particular way you recognize a performance when you have spent years managing one of your own, as carefully constructed. She called from an unknown number at 7:12 in the morning, 17 days after the order was granted, which meant someone had advised her on how to get through the filters. "This has gone far enough," she said. I noted the time on my lock screen before I answered. An automatic reflex by then. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," I said. "The order. This spectacle. Dorian is beside himself. His career is affected. His firm's relationships are—" "Is his career more important than my safety?" I asked. Not combatively. Genuinely. She paused. "Nothing happened to you." I thought about the bruise in the shape of 4 fingers. I thought about 22 months of documented incidents, as indexed and time-stamped and stored in 3 cloud locations. "I have to go," I said. "If you proceed with this," she said, and her voice changed register, became quieter, which in my experience is always more significant than becoming louder. "There will be consequences. Dorian has connections. His firm has relationships with people who know people who—" I ended the call. I sat for a moment. Then I took a screenshot of the call log. Unknown number, 7:12 a.m., duration 4 minutes and 14 seconds. And I wrote a detailed note in my documentation file. The exact time, the specific words she had used, including the phrasing consequences and knows people, with my description of the tone shift. I forwarded this to Gideon before 8 a.m. He called within 20 minutes. "Third-party contact on behalf of the restrained party. Or, sir, that's a violation of the order as written." "I know," I said. "Do you want to file?" I thought carefully. "Not yet. Let me think about what's most useful." What followed was an 11-week campaign. I want to describe it in sequence because the sequence matters, because it shows not random pressure, but organized escalation, and that pattern of organized escalation was itself eventually entered into the record. Arabella called twice more over the following 3 weeks, from 2 different unknown numbers, with variations on the same message. The order was destroying Dorian's life, his career, his reputation. I was misrepresenting what had happened. I needed to consider what I was doing to a good man. I documented every call, duration, content, the specific language used, any threats implied or stated. Tus, a man who identified himself as a colleague of Dorian's, called my work number on a Tuesday afternoon. He said he was reaching out as a wellness check. He said he'd been hearing I was going through a difficult time and wanted to make sure I was getting the right kind of support. He mentioned, in passing, that Dorian had spoken very highly of me and was deeply hurt by recent events. I thanked him politely, ended the call, and documented it with the timestamp visible in the system log and the specific language about right kind of support preserved in direct quotation. A woman I had once been friendly with, someone from a part of my social life that had existed primarily through Dorian's network, contacted me via a message platform with a variation of the "I've been hearing things" framing. But she wanted me to know that people were concerned about the path I was on. She hoped I was taking care of myself. She asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I'd considered talking to someone before making any permanent decisions about the legal situation. I blocked her. I took a screenshot first. And then the letter arrived. It was delivered to my work address, not my home address, which I had gone to considerable trouble to keep out of any documentation available to Dorian's team, which meant someone had researched my employer specifically, which was itself a form of investigation that violated the spirit of the order, if not its letter. The letter was from a private attorney representing Dorian, written on professional letterhead, and it stated that the protective order had been obtained through misrepresentation of the facts, that his client had not engaged in the behaviors described, and that if I did not voluntarily dismiss the petition within 30 days, his client was prepared to take corrective legal action, including a countersuit for defamation. I read it once. I photographed it. I added it to the file. Gideon reviewed it and told me, with the precision that I had come to appreciate as his signature mode, "This letter is a document. It's not a threat he can carry out. The threshold for defamation requires public statements made with malice, and a private court petition doesn't meet that standard. But it's evidence of organized pressure. Combined with the phone contacts and the third-party outreach, we now have documentation of a sustained, coordinated effort to influence your exercise of legal rights." Well, if that's a pattern. "What do we do with the pattern?" I asked. "We keep building it," he said, and we think very carefully about what we want to do next. The direct approach came on a Tuesday morning in early March. I had been varying my walking routes since the order was granted. Not every day, but often enough to avoid predictability. That Tuesday, I hadn't varied. I was tired, and it was early, and I had a meeting I was already slightly late for, and I took the familiar route because familiarity costs less mental energy in the morning. I heard his voice behind me on the street. "Mara." The street was not empty. There were commuters moving in the usual morning direction, a van double-parked outside a cafe, a woman with a dog on a retractable lead. The texture of a city at 8:15 on a Tuesday, the particular ordinary texture that makes violence feel impossible and therefore isn't actually a deterrent to it. I stopped. I turned around slowly. He was standing approximately 20 feet away. He had chosen this distance with care. Not close enough to read as obviously threatening. Not distant enough to claim coincidence. His hands were in the pockets of his coat, and he was looking at me with the expression I recognized from the beginning. The attentive look. The one that said, "You are the most interesting problem in this space, and I have been thinking about you." "I just want to talk," he said. The order prohibited him from coming within 300 feet of me. He was at 20 feet. Showed he was looking at me, and the look had not changed, and that was the most frightening thing, that even now, legally restrained, documented, with 19 months of evidence sitting in 3 cloud backup locations, he was standing 20 feet away with that expression and asking me to listen. My thumb found the voice recorder app before I had consciously decided to use it. I had configured it months earlier to record with a single tap from the lock screen. The phone was in my coat pocket, and I pressed the button without taking the phone out. I did not speak to him. I stepped to the left. I raised my phone, and I took a photograph. Him, standing on that street, the buildings behind him, my timestamp visible in the corner. He watched me do it. Something moved across his expression. Recognition, maybe, or the first edge of recalibration. "Mara," he said again, and his voice shifted register. "If you would just listen for 5 minutes." I walked away. Deliberately. Not running. The measured walk of someone who knows that what they're walking away from will be handled in a different arena. I called Gideon from the next block with the particular steadiness that comes not from calm, but from having prepared for this exact moment. "He's on Harrow Street," I said. "I have a photograph with a visible timestamp. I have audio from the recorder, started approximately 30 seconds before verbal contact. He made direct verbal contact." Gideon was silent for 2 seconds. "File a police report today. Now, while the details are fresh. Go directly from where you are." I went. Officer Ferris worked out of the district precinct 3 blocks from my office. He was young, early 30s. His careful manner, the specific attentiveness of someone recently trained in handling these situations correctly. He asked clarifying questions without skepticism. He took the photograph and transferred the audio file and looked, for a long time, at the documentation log I had printed and been carrying daily in a sealed envelope in my work bag. "You maintained this yourself?" he said. "With my attorney's guidance," I said. "I've been keeping time-stamped records for approximately 22 months. The protective order has been in place for about 9 weeks. This level of documentation, it starts earlier than the order," I said, "from before I left, when I didn't know yet what I was building toward." He looked at me with an expression I have thought about since, not disbelief, not quite admiration, but something more professional than either. The expression of a person who has seen many cases and recognizes, in this one, something different. He took everything. Gideon's contact information, the complete file, every document. They spoke that afternoon. Gideon called me afterward. "This is a clean violation," he said. "The photograph places him well within the exclusion zone. The audio establishes direct verbal contact. His attorney will likely try to characterize it as inadvertent. He was in the area for another reason, didn't realize how close he was." "Of course," I said. "Are you prepared for what comes next?" Gideon laid out the options over 2 meetings. The first option was the straightforward path: report the violation, pursue consequences, maintain the order. The likely outcome, given the documentation, was a formal warning. Dorian's attorney would argue mitigating circumstances. First violation, no physical contact, evidence of remorse. The court, working from a full calendar, would likely accept a modified arrangement. The order would remain, but the violation would be effectively noted and filed. The second option was more deliberate. Gideon explained it with care. He was methodical about what it required and precise about what it risked. "I can't advise you to create a trap," he said. "That's entrapment, and it's not something I'll help with. What I can help you do is create conditions under which any voluntary contact he makes lands with maximum legal consequence. And you can do this by making a move that looks, from the outside, like capitulation." "Dropping the order," I said, "voluntarily, on the record, and in a way that positions any subsequent contact as entirely willful." He paused. "If the order is dismissed and he contacts you within a short window, and based on his behavior over the last 11 weeks, I believe he will contact you within hours. The context changes entirely. A judge reads deliberate contact immediately after dismissal very differently than a first violation of an active order. It speaks to a person who has no intention of modifying his behavior, who used the order as the reason for restraint, rather than any internal disposition toward restraint." "Meaning the order wasn't deterring him," I said. "It was just constraining him." "Precisely. And proving that distinction is the difference between a warning and a conviction." I thought about the morning on Harrow Street, the 20 feet of distance, at the attentive expression, the 5 minutes he'd asked for, standing there in the knowledge that he was already in violation. "Walk me through what preparation would look like," I said. "It took 3 weeks. I'll describe the mechanism in full because the mechanism is the core of the story. This is where the work happened. First, I met with Officer Ferris and his supervising sergeant. I met with a detective from the Domestic Crimes Unit, someone whose name I was asked to keep out of public documentation, which I respected. I brought my complete file. Not a selection, everything. The 22 months of time-stamped notes, every photograph, all the audio files, the letter from Dorian's attorney, the documented third-party contacts, Arabella's calls, the colleague who called my work number for a wellness check, the former friend's message. Everything organized chronologically and cross-referenced by category. I walked them through it, item by item, with Gideon present. The detective said something that I had already known from my own research but needed to hear confirmed. The prior street violation was on record. It hadn't resulted in charges because first violations rarely do, and the documentation at that stage hadn't been fully reviewed by the DA's office. But it was there. And a second violation, particularly a deliberate one, particularly one that came within a short window of the order's dismissal and could be shown to be volitional, could support felony charges under the state domestic violence enhancement statutes. "What does the window need to look like?" I asked. "The shorter the better," he said. "Contact within 24 hours of dismissal, as with documentation showing deliberateness. That looks willful to any jury. Contact within 48 is still strong. Contact within a week is usable. Beyond a week, you start having arguments about timing." He'll come within 24 hours, I said. The detective looked at me, not skeptically, just noting it. You sound certain? He has been waiting for this for 11 weeks, I said. The order is the only thing between him and the belief that he can manage this situation. The moment it's gone, he will act on that belief. That's not speculation. It's consistent with everything in that file. Gideon said nothing. He'd read the file. Second, I moved. Not obviously, not visibly. I maintained the complete appearance of living at my current address. I was still receiving mail there, still entering and exiting at regular times, as still appearing on the building's key fob records. But I had arranged, through a subletting agreement I'd drafted and had Gideon review, to stay temporarily at an apartment belonging to a woman I had met through work 3 years earlier, before Dorian had begun the systematic reduction of my social world. She was not in any documentation associated with our shared life. She had no social media presence Dorian could locate. There was no photograph of the two of us on any platform either of us had used in the past 4 years. At my listed address, I installed 3 additional cameras. They were added to the existing building security infrastructure, positioned to cover the entry to my unit from 3 distinct angles, with audio capability. I had written notification in the building manager's hands. She cooperated without hesitation and with a speed that suggested she understood the context. All cameras fed to a cloud storage account with automatic time-stamped backup. Every alert was configured to trigger notifications simultaneously to my phone, Gideon's email, and Officer Ferris's work address. Third, I tested the chain. I called Gideon at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. He answered in 2 rings. I called Officer Ferris at the same time the following evening. He answered. The detective was reachable on a dedicated contact number. All 3 had confirmed explicitly that they would be on active standby in the 72-hour window following the order's dismissal. Fourth, and this is the one I want to be precise about, I prepared a briefing document, a single page, clean, organized, every form of contact Dorian was likely to attempt, cross-referenced against the legal threshold required for it to constitute a chargeable violation. Physical approach within the exclusion zone, phone contact, text message, email from any address, proxy contact, delivery of a physical item to my address. I had drafted this with Gideon's guidance over the course of 2 sessions, and it had been reviewed and approved by the detective. Every party who might receive a notification from my camera system had a copy of this document. Every person in my notification chain knew exactly what a given action meant in legal terms and exactly what the response should be. There was no improvisation. There was no reliance on chance. There was only preparation, done over 3 weeks, built on 22 months of documentation, designed to hold up under any level of scrutiny. And the motion to dismiss was filed on a Thursday and granted that afternoon. I sat in the gallery in a gray coat. Dorian's attorney stood at the petitioner's table and had the expression of someone receiving an unexpected gift. The pleasant disorientation of an outcome he had worked hard for, and had, I think, not entirely believed he would get. Dorian was 2 rows to my left. I did not look at him directly. I looked at the judge, who read the motion and granted it in 45 seconds. And then I looked at the middle distance, while the clerk processed the paperwork, and the room rearranged itself. Gideon was behind me, speaking quietly to someone. The order was dismissed at 2:19 p.m. In the car afterward, Elena drove without asking where. She had been present at both preparatory meetings. She had helped me find the temporary apartment, and had been part of the camera installation, and had driven me to the precinct twice. She knew the complete architecture of what we had built. "He'll come tonight," she said. Not a question. Tonight or early tomorrow, I said. He won't wait. He's been waiting for 11 weeks and he doesn't have the patience for another day of it. The order was the obstacle. Now the obstacle is gone. She drove for a block. The afternoon light was coming in at the low, direct angle of late autumn. The kind of light that makes everything look slightly temporary, slightly overexposed. Are you ready? She asked. I thought about this carefully. I thought about the cold tile floor of a bathroom in October, 2 years earlier, looking at a bruise in the shape of fingers. And I thought about opening the grocery lists app for the first time and typing the first entry. Date, time, what was said, what preceded it. I thought about the library computer and the cloud account and the lockbox at the postal center and the small, careful series of invisible preparations that had built over 22 months into something Dorian had no idea existed. Yes, I said. It was not bravado. It was the specific confidence of someone who has done the work. He came at 11:47 p.m. The camera alert arrived on my phone at 11:48, a figure approaching the main entrance of my building, collar up. The footage was clear. His face was visible for 3 seconds when he turned toward the entry camera. At 11:49, the buzzer for my unit was pressed 3 times. There is audio. You can hear it. I was at the temporary apartment, and I had been lying on the narrow bed with my phone in my hand for 3 hours, reading nothing, waiting. I forwarded the first 2 clips to Gideon at 11:52 with a single line. 11 hours and 33 minutes post-dismissal. He's at the building. At 11:54, Gideon acknowledged receipt. At 11:58, the external camera captured him walking back to a vehicle at the curb and sitting in it. He did not leave. He sat in the vehicle outside my building for 8 minutes. At 12:04, my phone rang from his number. I did not answer. The call was automatically logged. At 12:06, a text message arrived. I just need 5 minutes. I know you're home. I saw the light. There was no light. I was not home. The message was preserved in its entirety, content, timestamp, originating number, in the screenshot I took at 12:07 at 12:09. A second camera angle captured him getting out of the vehicle briefly, looking up at my building's facade, and returning to the car. At 12:15, he drove away. By 12:17 a.m., Gideon had assembled a complete package for the detective and Officer Ferris. The 2 camera clips, the audio of the buzzer, the phone call log, the text message screenshot, the calculation of elapsed time from the order's dismissal, 11 hours and 58 minutes, and a 1-paragraph summary of the legal basis for immediate action. At 12:17 a.m., I received a text from Gideon. This is enough. Send it, I said. The arrest happened at 7:30 the following morning, and Officer Ferris called me at 8:15 with the particular careful neutrality of a professional and the particular undertone of something I can only describe as satisfaction on behalf of a process that had worked as it was designed to. He's in custody, he said. Processing now. Bail hearing today. The DA's office has reviewed the documentation and is proceeding. What are the charges? Violation of a protective order with prior documented violation in the record. The street incident has been formally incorporated. The enhancement statute applies. Given the window, less than 12 hours post-dismissal, with documented deliberateness evidenced by the text message and the phone call, the DA's position is that this was not inadvertent contact. This was intentional. And? They're not offering a plea to a misdemeanor, Ferris said. They're proceeding felony." I sat with that for a moment. The morning light in the temporary apartment was the particular pale quality of early November. Not warm, not cold, just present. "Thank you," I said. "Your attorney built a solid case," Ferris said. "We executed it, but the foundation was yours." The trial took 7 months. I won't compress it into a single paragraph, because compressing it would imply that it was simple or inevitable, and it was neither. It was 7 months of very careful, very precise work in an adversarial arena designed to find the weaknesses in everything you've built. Dorian's defense was that the contact had been inadvertent, that he had been in the area for a separate reason, that the text message had been sent in a moment of emotional distress. Grief, he said, and at the loss of a significant relationship, and did not constitute harassment or willful violation. Gideon presented the counter to this systematically. He presented the complete documentation file, 22 months of time-stamped notes, the photographs, the audio recordings, the organized log of third-party contacts that constituted an 11-week coordinated pressure campaign after the original order was granted. He presented the letter from Dorian's attorney threatening corrective legal action, which, in the context of the defense's argument that the contact was inadvertent and grief-driven, read as something else entirely. He presented Arabella's calls, what with the specific language about consequences and Dorian has connections, which established that the dismissal of the order had been an organized goal of the entire Crow family network, not a natural resolution. He presented the street incident, the photograph from Harrow Street, the audio, the 20-foot distance, the prior documented violation that had been on record from the first filing. He presented the camera footage from the night of November 14th, 11:47 p.m. arrival, 11 hours and 58 minutes after dismissal. The buzzer pressed 3 times. 8 minutes sitting in a vehicle outside the building. The phone call at 12:04. The text message at 12:06. "I know you're home. I saw the light." And he presented the elapsed time calculation, which was perhaps the simplest and most devastating piece of evidence in the package. From the moment the order was dismissed in that courtroom at 2:19 p.m. to the moment Dorian pressed the buzzer on my building at 11:49 p.m. was 9 hours and 30 minutes. From order dismissal to text message, 9 hours and 47 minutes. 9 hours. "This is not grief," Gideon told the jury. Not dramatically. He said it in the same even, precise tone he used for everything. "This is someone who has been waiting, counting the hours, who made a calculation that the legal barrier was gone, and who acted on that calculation before midnight of the same day." I testified for 3 hours. I was composed. Not performatively composed, not the composed of someone suppressing visible emotion for an audience, but the composed of someone who has been organizing the story of her own life into evidence for 19 months, and has, in the process, arrived at a particular relationship with the facts. They are precise, they are documented, and they are not available to be rewritten. When I described the kitchen incident, the grip, the bruise, the cold tile floor of the bathroom at 10:47 p.m., I described it in the exact language I had used in the note I'd written the following morning. Not because I was performing precision, because the precision was what I had used for all those months to stay anchored to the reality that someone was continuously trying to distort. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and 20 minutes. Guilty. The judge's sentencing statement cited the sustained and organized nature of the behavior documented in evidence and the deliberate quality of the violation occurring within hours of the order's dismissal in a manner that demonstrates not inadvertence, but intention. He used the phrase sustained campaign of coercive control. He sentenced Dorian to 3 years. I wrote the phrase sustained campaign on the notepad I was holding, in the same looping handwriting I had used for every note in the grocery lists file, and I folded the paper and put it in my coat pocket, and I did not look at Dorian. 3 days after the sentencing, I went back to Gideon's office to collect some documents. And his office above the dry cleaner had a particular quality in the late afternoon. The light came in at an angle through the east-facing window and illuminated the dust in the air in a way that looked accidental and warm. He had made tea, which he set on the corner of the desk without comment. We went through the paperwork that needed signatures, case closeouts, billing, the standard administrative conclusion of a matter that had run for 19 months and involved, by my count, 47 filed documents. When we were done, he looked at me over his reading glasses with the evaluating expression I had come to associate with things he found genuinely worth noting. "You know what won this?" he said. "The documentation," I said. "The documentation," he agreed. "Not the protective order, not the violations per se, not even the arrest, as all of those required the documentation to mean what they meant." He paused. "The system acts on evidence that comes to it. It does not find evidence for you. What you brought in, that first day in those folders, was a case. Everything that happened afterward was the case doing what cases do when they're built correctly." I thought about the first entry in the grocery lists file, 2.5 years earlier, a Thursday evening in late summer, writing down a conversation that had made me uncomfortable, using a format I had arrived at intuitively because my work brain had understood, even then, that precision was protection. I thought about the photograph at 10:47 p.m. on a tile floor. I thought about the library computer and the cloud account and the lockbox. And I thought about 3 weeks of preparation, cameras and notification chains, and a 1-page briefing document, and a friend's narrow bed and a phone I didn't put down for 3 hours. None of it had been dramatic. All of it had been exactly sufficient. "Thank you," I said, "for everything." He nodded. He picked up his tea. I picked up my documents and my coat, and I walked down the stairs and out past the dry cleaner and into the street. There are things I know now that I want to put in language, because the story ends, and there's a version of this where I tell you that I found peace, or wholeness, or arrived somewhere complete. And I want to be precise, rather than comfortable. But what I found was this. The documentation practice that I began as self-clarification, writing down what had happened because I needed to know whether I was catastrophizing, became the architecture of the entire legal outcome. It did not start as evidence building. It started as sanity maintenance. The fact that it became both is not an accident of timing. It is what good record-keeping does. A time-stamped note about a conversation that made you uncomfortable is not paranoia. It is the only form of memory that courts can use. Your account of your own experience, in your own words, dated and time-stamped and stored in a location only you control, is the most powerful document available to you. It costs nothing except the habit. A separate bank account opened quietly at an institution with no connection to your shared financial life. It is a legal and entirely ordinary act. A credit union in a different neighborhood. An account in your name only. The opening deposit can be small. What it gives you is not just money. It gives you optionality. The ability to act at the moment you need to act, without needing anything from the person you're leaving. Document storage, physical and digital, matters more than most people imagine. The originals of your own documents belong to you, not to the shared life. Moving them is not adversarial. It is prudent. And backing up digital evidence to a cloud account that has no connection to any shared service, that runs automatically, that timestamps every upload, is something that can be configured in an afternoon and maintained with zero ongoing effort. A voice recorder app running from the lock screen captures what happens in the moments when you don't have time to do anything except press a button. And the notification chain, the network of people who have a copy of your documentation and who can receive an alert and respond within a short window, is not something you build once and stop thinking about. It requires maintenance, confirmation, the explicit agreement of specific people to be available in specific windows. None of this is dramatic. None of it requires unusual courage or unusual resources. It requires consistency. The willingness to document the small things before you know they'll matter. The willingness to build quietly, invisibly for months, toward an outcome you can only guess at. 3 weeks after sentencing, a formal letter arrived from Dorian's attorney. It was standard: notification of sentence, a projected release date, note regarding post-release conditions, including a mandatory no-contact provision folded into the sentencing terms. I read it once, standing at the kitchen counter in the late morning with a cup of tea that was the right temperature because I had remembered to drink it while it was warm. I opened my phone. I went to the grocery lists app. I opened the main documentation folder. I created a new subfolder. I titled it Closed. I filed the letter. Then I put the phone face down on the counter, and I finished my tea. And I went about my day.